Chapter 5. Hazel. Hazel felt like she'd just introduced 2 nuclear bombs. Now she was waiting to see which one exploded first. Until that morning, her brother Nico had been the most powerful demigod she knew. The others at Camp Jupiter saw him as a travelling oddball, about as harmless as the fawns. Hazel knew better. She hadn't grown up with Nico, hadn't even known him very long, but she knew Nico was more dangerous than Raina, or Octavian, or maybe even Jason. Then she'd met Percy. At first, when she saw him stumbling up the highway with the old lady in his arms, Hazel had thought he might be a god in disguise. Even though he was beaten up, dirty and stooped with exhaustion, he'd had an aura of power. He'd had the good looks of a Roman god with sea-green eyes and wind-blown black hair. She'd ordered Frank not to fire on him. She thought the gods might be testing them. She'd heard myths like that. A kid with an old lady begs for shelter, and when the rude mortals refuse, boom, they get turned into banana slugs. Then Percy had controlled the river and destroyed the Gorgons. He'd turned a pen into a bronze sword. He'd stirred up the whole camp with talk about the Gracious, a son of the sea god. Long ago, Hazel had been told that a descendant of Neptune would save her. But could Percy really take away her curse? It seemed too much to hope for. Percy and Nico shook hands. They studied each other warily, and Hazel fought the urge to run. If these two busted out the magic swords, things could get ugly. Nico didn't appear scary. He was skinny and sloppy in his rumpled black clothes. His hair, as always, looked like he just rolled out of bed. Hazel remembered when she'd met him, the first time she'd seen him draw that black sword of his. She'd almost laughed. The way he called it Stygian iron. All serious-like. He'd looked ridiculous. This scrawny white boy was no fighter. She certainly had believed they were related. She had changed her mind about that quick enough. Percy scowled. I know you. Nico raised his eyebrows. Do you? He looked at Hazel for explanation. Hazel hesitated. Something about her brother's reaction wasn't right. He was trying hard to act casual, but when he had first seen Percy, Hazel had noticed his momentary look of panic. Nico already knew Percy. She was sure of it. Why was he pretending otherwise? Hazel forced herself to speak. Percy's lost his memory. She told her brother what had happened since Percy had arrived at the gates. So, Nico, she continued carefully, I thought, you travel all over. Maybe you've met demigods like Percy before, or... Nico's expression turned as dark as Tartarus. Hazel didn't understand why, but she got the message. Drop it. This story about Gaia's army, Nico said. You warned Raina? Percy nodded. Who is Gaia, anyway? Hazel's mouth went dry, just hearing that name. It was all she could do to keep her knees from buckling. She remembered a woman's soft, sleepy voice, a glowing cave, and feeling her lungs fill with black oil. She's the earth goddess. Nico glanced at the ground as it might be listening. The oldest goddess of all. She's in a deep sleep most of the time, but she hates the gods and their children. Mother Earth is evil? Percy asked. Very, Nico said gravely. She convinced her son, the Titan Saturn, to kill his dad, Uranus, and take over the world. The Titans ruled for a long time, and then the Titans' children, the Olympian gods, overthrew them. That story seems familiar. Percy sounded surprised, like the old memory had partially surfaced. But I don't think I ever heard the part about Gaia. Nico shrugged. She got mad when the gods took over. She took a new husband, Tartarus, the spirit of the abyss, and gave birth to a race of giants. They tried to destroy Mount Olympus, but the gods finally beat them. At least, the first time. The first time? Percy repeated. Nico glanced at Hazel. He probably wasn't meaning to make her feel guilty, but she couldn't help it. If Percy knew the truth about her and the horrible things she'd done. Last summer, Nico continued, Saturn tried to make a comeback. There was a second Titan war. The Romans at Camp Jupiter stormed his headquarters on Mount Orpheus, across the bay, and destroyed his throne. Saturn disappeared. He hesitated, watching Percy's face. Hazel got the feeling her brother was nervous that more of Percy's memory might come back. Anyway, Nico continued, Saturn probably faded back to the abyss. We all thought the war was over. Now it looks like the Titans' defeat stirred up Gaia. She's starting to wake. I've heard reports of giants being reborn. If they mean to challenge the gods again, they'll probably start by destroying the demigods. You've told Raina this? Percy asked. Of course. Nico's jaw tensed. The Romans don't trust me. That's why I was hoping she'd listen to you. Children of Pluto. Well, no offence, but they think we're even worse than children of Neptune. We're bad luck. They let Hazel stay here, Percy noted. That's different, Nico said. Why? Percy, Hazel cut in. Look, the giants aren't the worst problem. Even Even Gaia isn't the worst problem. The thing you noticed about the Gorgons, how they wouldn't die, that's our biggest worry. She looked at Nico. She was getting dangerously close to her own secret now, but for some reason Hazel trusted Percy. Maybe because he was also an outsider. Maybe because he'd saved Frank at the river. He deserved to know what they were facing. Nico and I, she said carefully, we think that what's happening is... Death isn't... Before she could finish, a shout came from down the hill. Frank jogged towards them, wearing his jeans, purple camp shirt and denim jacket. His hands were covered with grease from cleaning weapons. As it did every time he saw Frank, Hazel's heart performed a little skip-beat tap dance, which really irritated her. Sure, he was a good friend, one of the only people at camp who didn't treat her as if she had a contagious disease, but she didn't like him in that way. He was 3 years older than she was, and he wasn't exactly Prince Charming, with that strange combination of baby face and bulky wrestler's body. He looked like a cuddly koala bear with muscles. The fact that everyone always tried to pair them up, the two biggest losers at camp, you guys are perfect for each other, just made Hazel more determined not to like him. But her heart wasn't with the programme. It went nuts whenever Frank was around. She hadn't felt like that since Sammy. Stop it, she thought. You're here for one reason, and it isn't to get a new boyfriend. Besides, Frank didn't know her secret. If he knew, he wouldn't be so nice to her. He reached the shrine. Hey, Nico. Frank. Nico smiled. He seemed to find Frank amusing, maybe because Frank was the only one at camp who wasn't uneasy around the children of Pluto. Raina sent me to get Percy, Frank said. Did Octavian accept you? Yeah, Percy said. He slaughtered my panda. The augury. Yeah, teddy bears must have nightmares about that guy. But you're in. We need to get you cleaned up before evening muster. Hazel realised the sun was getting low over the hills. How had the day gone so fast? You're right, she said. We'd better... Frank, Nico interrupted. Why don't you take Percy down? Hazel and I will be along soon. Uh-oh, Hazel thought. She tried not to look anxious. That's a good idea, she managed. Go ahead, guys, we'll catch up. Percy looked at Nico one more time, as though he were still trying to place a memory. I'd like to talk with you some more. I can't shake the feeling. Sure, Nico agreed. Later, I'll be staying overnight. You will, Hazel blurted. The campers were going to love that. The son of Neptune and the son of Pluto arriving on the same day. Now all they needed was some black cats and broken mirrors. Go on, Percy, Nico said. Settle in. He turned to Hazel, and she got the sense that the worst part of her day was yet to come. My sister and I need to talk. You know him, don't you? Hazel said. They sat on the roof of Pluto's shrine, which was covered with bones and diamonds. As far as Hazel knew, the bones had always been there. The diamonds were her fault. If she sat anywhere too long, or just got anxious, they started popping up all around her, like mushrooms after a rain. Several $1 million worth of stones glittered on the roof, but fortunately the other campers wouldn't touch them. They knew better than to steal from temples, especially Pluto's, and the fawns never came up here. Hazel shuddered, remembering her close call with Don that afternoon. If she hadn't moved quickly and snatched that diamond off the road, she didn't want to think about it. She didn't need another death on her conscience. Nico swung his feet like a little kid. His Stygian iron sword lay by his side, next to Hazel's spather. He gazed across the valley, where construction crews were working in the field of Mars, building fortifications for tonight's games. Percy Jackson. He said the name like an incantation. Hazel, I have to be careful what I say. Important things are at work here. Some secrets need to stay secret. You of all people, you should understand that. Hazel's cheeks felt hot. But he's not like me. No, Nico said. I'm sorry I can't tell you more. I can't interfere. Percy has to find his own way at this camp. Is he dangerous? She asked. Nico managed a dry smile. Very, to his enemies. But he's not a threat to Camp Jupiter. You can trust him. Like I trust you, Hazel said bitterly. Nico twisted his skull ring. Around him, bones began to quiver as if they were trying to form a new skeleton. Whenever he got moody, Nico had that effect on the dead, kind of like Hazel's curse. Between them, they represented Pluto's two spheres of control, death and riches. Sometimes Hazel thought Nico had got the better end of the deal. Look, I know this is hard, Nico said, but you have a second chance. You can make things right. Nothing about this is right, Hazel said, if they find out the truth about me. They won't, Nico promised. They'll call a quest soon. They have to. You make me proud. Trust me. But... He caught himself. But Hazel knew what he'd almost called her. Bianca. Nico's real sister. The one he'd grown up with. Nico might care about Hazel, but she'd never be Bianca. Hazel was simply the best thing Nico could manage, a consolation prize from the underworld. I'm sorry, he said. Hazel's mouth tasted like metal, as if gold nuggets were popping up under her tongue. Then it's true about death. Is Alcyone's to blame? I think so, Nico said. It's getting bad in the underworld. Dad's going crazy trying to keep things under control. From what Percy said about the Gorgons, things are getting worse up here too. But look, that's why you're here. All that stuff in your past. You can make something good come out of it. You belong at Camp Jupiter. That sounded so ridiculous, Hazel almost laughed. She didn't belong in this place. She didn't even belong in this century. She should have known better than to focus on the past, but she remembered the day when her old life had been shattered. The blackout hit her so suddenly, she didn't even have time to say, uh-oh. She shifted back in time, not a dream or a vision. The memory washed over her with such perfect clarity that she felt she was actually there. Her most recent birthday. She just turned 13, but not last December. 17th of December, 1941, the last day she had lived in New Orleans. Chapter 6. Hazel. Hazel was walking home alone from the riding stables. Despite the cold evening, she was buzzing with warmth. Sammy had just kissed her on the cheek. The day had been full of ups and downs. Kids at school had teased her about her mother, calling her a witch and a lot of other names. That had been going on for a long time, of course, but it was getting worse. Rumours were spreading about Hazel's curse. The school was called St. Agnes Academy for coloured children and Indians, a name that hadn't changed in 100 years. Just like its name, the place masked a whole lot of cruelty under a thin veneer of kindness. Hazel didn't understand how other black kids could be so mean. They should have known better, since they themselves had to put up with name-calling all the time. But they yelled at her and stole her lunch, always asking for those famous jewels. Where's those cursed diamonds, girl? Give me some or I'll hurt you. They pushed her away at the water fountain and threw rocks at her if she tried to approach them on the playground. Despite how horrible they were, Hazel never gave them diamonds or gold. She didn't hate anyone that much. Besides, she had one friend, Sammy, and that was enough. Sammy liked to joke that he was the perfect St. Agnes student. He was Mexican-American, so he considered himself coloured and Indian. That should give me a double scholarship, he said. He wasn't big or strong, but he had a crazy smile, and he made Hazel laugh. That afternoon he'd taken her to the stables, where he worked as a groom. It was a whites-only riding club, of course, but it was closed on weekdays, and, with the war on, there was talk that the club might have to shut down completely until the Japanese were whipped and the soldiers came back home. Sammy could usually sneak Hazel in to help take care of the horses. Once in a while they'd go riding. Hazel loved horses. They seemed to be the only living things that weren't scared of her. People hated her. Cats hissed, dogs growled, even the stupid hamster in Miss Finley's classroom squeaked in terror when she gave it a carrot. But horses didn't mind. When she was in the saddle, she could ride so fast that there was no chance of gemstones cropping up in her wake. She almost felt free of her curse. That afternoon, she'd taken out a tan-roan stallion with a gorgeous black mane. She galloped into the field so swiftly. She left Sammy behind. By the time he caught up, he and his horse were both winded. "What are you running from?" he laughed. "I'm not that ugly, am I?" It was too cold for a picnic, but they had one anyway, sitting under a magnolia tree, with the horses tethered to a split-rail fence. Sammy had brought her a cupcake with a birthday candle, which had got smashed on the ride, but was still the sweetest thing Hazel had ever seen. They broke it in half and shared it. Sammy talked about the war. He wished he were old enough to go. He asked Hazel if she would write him letters if he were a soldier going overseas. "Course, dummy," she said. He grinned, and then, as if moved by a sudden impulse, he lurched forward and kissed her on the cheek. "Happy birthday, Hazel." It wasn't much, just one kiss, and not even on the lips, but Hazel felt like she was floating. She hardly remembered the ride back to the stables or telling Sammy goodbye. He said, "See you tomorrow," like he always did, but she would never see him again. By the time she got back to the French Quarter, it was getting dark. As she approached home, her warm feeling faded, replaced by dread. Hazel and her mother, Queen Marie, she liked to be called, lived in an old apartment above a jazz club. Despite the beginning of the war, there was a festive mood in the air. New recruits would roam the streets, laughing and talking about fighting the Japanese. They'd get tattoos in the parlours, or propose to their sweethearts right on the sidewalk. Some would go upstairs to Hazel's mother to have their fortunes read, or to buy charms from Marie Levesque, the famous Gris-Gris queen. "Did you hear?" one would say. "2 bits for this good luck charm. I took it to a guy I know, and he says it's real silver nugget, worth $20. The voodoo woman is crazy." For a while, that kind of talk brought Queen Marie a lot of business. Hazel's curse had started out slowly. At first it seemed like a blessing. The precious stones and gold only appeared once in a while, never in huge quantities. Queen Marie paid her bills. They ate steak for dinner once a week. Hazel even got a new dress. But then stories started spreading. The locals began to realise how many horrible things happened to people who bought those good luck charms or got paid with Queen Marie's treasure. Charlie Gasco lost his arm in a harvester while wearing a gold bracelet. Mr. Henry at the general store dropped dead from a heart attack after Queen Marie settled her tab with a ruby. Folks started whispering about Hazel, how she could find cursed jewels just by walking down the street. These days, only out-of-towners came to visit her mother, and not so many of them either. Hazel's mum had become short-tempered. She gave Hazel resentful looks. Hazel climbed the stairs as quietly as she could, in case her mother had a customer. In the club downstairs, the band was tuning their instruments. The bakery next door had started making fritters for tomorrow morning, filling the stairwell with the smell of melting butter. When she got to the top, Hazel thought she heard two voices inside the apartment, but when she peeked into the parlour, her mother was sitting alone at the séance table, her eyes closed, as if in a trance. Hazel had seen her that way many times, pretending to talk to spirits for her clients, but not ever when she was by herself. Queen Marie had always told Hazel her gree-gree was bunk and hokum. She didn't really believe in charms or fortune-telling or ghosts. She was just a performer, like a singer or an actress, doing a show for money. But Hazel knew her mother did believe in some magic. Hazel's curse wasn't hokum. Queen Marie just didn't want to think it was her fault, that somehow she had made Hazel the way she was. It was your blasted father, Queen Marie would grumble in her darker moods, coming here in his fancy silver and black suit. The one time I actually summon a spirit, and what do I get? Fulfills my wish and ruins my life. I should have been a real queen. It's his fault you turned out this way. She would never explain what she meant, and Hazel had learned not to ask about her father. It just made her mother angrier. As Hazel watched, Queen Marie muttered something to herself. Her face was calm and relaxed. Hazel was struck by how beautiful she looked, without her scowl and the creases in her brow. She had a lush mane of gold-brown hair like Hazel's, and the same dark complexion, brown as a roasted coffee bean. She wasn't wearing the fancy saffron robes or gold bangles she wore to impress clients, just a simple white dress. Still, she had a regal air, sitting straight and dignified in her gilded chair, as if she really were a queen. "You'll be safe there," she murmured, "far from the gods." Hazel stifled a scream. The voice, coming from her mother's mouth, wasn't hers. It sounded like an older woman's. The tone was soft and soothing, but also commanding, like a hypnotist, giving orders. Queen Marie tensed. She grimaced in her trance, and then spoke in her normal voice. "It's too far, too cold, too dangerous. He told me not to." The other voice responded, "What has he ever done for you? He gave you a poisoned child, but we can use her gift for good. We can strike back at the gods. You will be under my protection in the north, far from the gods' domain. I'll make my son your protector. You'll live like a queen at last." Queen Marie winced. But what about Hazel? Then her face contorted in a sneer. Both voices spoke in unison, as if they found something to agree on. "A poisoned child." Hazel fled down the stairs, her pulse racing. At the bottom she ran into a man in a dark suit. He gripped her shoulders with strong, cold fingers. "Easy, child," the man said. Hazel noticed the silver skull ring on his finger, then the strange fabric of his suit. In the shadows, the solid black wool seemed to shift and boil, forming images of faces in agony, as if lost souls were trying to escape from the folds of his cloths. His tie was black with platinum stripes, his shirt was tombstone grey. His face, Hazel's heart nearly leapt out of her throat. His skin was so white it looked almost blue, like cold milk. He had a flap of greasy black hair. His smile was kind enough, but his eyes were fiery and angry, full of mad power. Hazel had seen that look in the newsreels at the movie theatre. This man looked like that awful Adolf Hitler. He had no moustache, but otherwise he could have been Hitler's twin, or his father. Hazel tried to pull away. Even when the man let go, she couldn't seem to move. His eyes froze her in place. "Hazel Levesque," he said in a melancholy voice. "You've grown." Hazel started to tremble. At the base of the stairs, the cement stoop cracked under the man's feet. A glittering stone popped up from the concrete like the earth had spat out a watermelon seed. The man looked at it, unsurprised. He bent down. "Don't," Hazel cried. "It's cursed." He picked up the stone. A perfectly formed emerald. "Yes, it is. But not to me. So beautiful. Worth more than this building, I imagine." He slipped the emerald in his pocket. "I'm sorry for your fate, child. I imagine you hate me." Hazel didn't understand. The man sounded sad, as if he was personally responsible for her life. Then the truth hit her. A spirit in silver and black who'd fulfilled her mother's wishes and ruined her life. Her eyes widened. You You're my... He cupped his hand under her chin. I am Pluto. Life is never easy for my children, but you have a special burden. Now that you're 13, we must make provisions. She pushed his hand away. You did this to me? She demanded. You cursed me and my mother? You left us alone? Her eyes stung with tears. This rich white man in a fine suit was her father? Now that she was 13, he showed up for the first time and said he was sorry? You're evil, she shouted. You ruined our lives. Pluto's eyes narrowed. What has your mother told you, Hazel? Has she never explained her wish, or told you why you were born under a curse? Hazel was too angry to speak, but Pluto seemed to read the answers in her face. No, he sighed. I suppose she wouldn't. Much easier to blame me. What do you mean? Pluto sighed. Poor child. You were born too soon. I cannot see your future clearly, but someday you will find your place. A descendant of Neptune will wash away your curse and give you peace. I fear, though, that is not for many years. Hazel didn't follow any of that. Before she could respond, Pluto held out his hand. A sketch pad and a box of coloured pencils appeared in his palm. I understand you enjoy art and horseback riding, he said. These are for your art. As for the horse... His eyes gleamed. That you'll have to manage yourself. Now I must speak with your mother. Happy birthday, Hazel. He turned and headed up the stairs, just like that, as if he'd checked Hazel off his to-do list and had already forgotten her. Happy birthday. Go draw a picture. See you in another 13 years. She was so stunned, so angry, so upside-down confused that she just stood paralysed at the base of the steps. She wanted to throw down the coloured pencils and stomp on them. She wanted to charge after Pluto and kick him. She wanted to run away, find Sammy, steal a horse, leave town and never come back. But she didn't do any of those things. Above her, the apartment door opened and Pluto stepped inside. Hazel was still shivering from his cold touch, but she crept up the stairs to see what he would do. What would he say to Queen Marie? Who would speak back, Hazel's mother or this awful voice? When she reached the doorway, Hazel heard arguing. She peeked in. Her mother seemed back to normal, screaming and angry, throwing things around the parlour while Pluto tried to reason with her. Marie, it's insanity, he said. You'll be far beyond my power to protect you. Protect me, Queen Marie yelled. When have you ever protected me? Pluto's dark suit shimmered as if the souls trapped in the fabric were getting agitated. You have no idea, he said. I've kept you alive, you and the child. My enemies are everywhere among gods and men. Now, with the war on, it will only get worse. You must stay where I can. The police think I'm a murderer, Queen Marie shouted. My clients want to hang me as a witch, and Hazel, her curse is getting worse. Your protection is killing us. Pluto spread his hands in a pleading gesture. Marie, please. No. Queen Marie turned to the closet, pulled out a leather valise and threw it onto the table. We're leaving, she announced. You can keep your protection. We're going north. Marie, it's a trap, Pluto warned. Whoever's whispering in your ear, whoever's turning you against me. You turned me against you. She picked up a porcelain vase and threw it at him. It shattered on the floor, and precious stones spilled everywhere. Emeralds, rubies, diamonds. Hazel's entire collection. You won't survive, Pluto said. If you go north, you'll both die. I can foresee that clearly. Get out, she said. Hazel wished Pluto would stay and argue. Whatever her mother was talking about, Hazel didn't like it. But her father slashed his son, his hand across the air, and dissolved into shadows, like he really was a spirit. Queen Marie closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. Hazel was afraid the strange voice might possess her again, but when she spoke, she was her regular self. Hazel, she snapped, come out from behind that door. Trembling, Hazel obeyed. She clutched the sketch pad and coloured pencils to her chest. Her mother studied her like she was a bitter disappointment. A poisoned child, the voices had said. Pack a bag, she ordered. We're moving. Where? Hazel asked. Alaska, Queen Marie answered. You're going to make yourself useful. We're going to start a new life. The way her mother said that, it sounded as if they were going to create a new life for someone else, or something else. What did Pluto mean? Hazel asked. Is he really my father? He said you made a wish. Go to your room, her mother shouted. Pack. Hazel fled, and suddenly she was ripped out of the past. Nico was shaking her shoulders. You did it again. Hazel blinked. They were still sitting on the roof of Pluto's shrine. The sun was lower in the sky. More diamonds had surfaced around her, and her eyes stung from crying. Sorry, she murmured. Don't be, Nico said. Where were you? My mother's apartment. The day we moved. Nico nodded. He understood her history better than most people could. He was also a kid from the 1940s. He'd been born only a few years after Hazel, and had been locked away in a magic hotel for decades. But Hazel's past was much worse than Nico's. She'd caused so much damage and misery. You have to work on controlling those memories, Nico warned. If a flashback like that happens when you're in combat. I know, she said. I'm trying. Nico squeezed her hand. It's okay. I think it's a side effect from, your time in the underworld. Hopefully it'll get easier. Hazel wasn't so sure. After 8 months, the blackout seemed to be getting worse, as if her soul was attempting to live in 2 different time periods at once. No one had ever come back from the dead before, at least not the way she had. Nico was trying to reassure her, but neither of them knew what would happen. I can't go north again, Hazel said. Nico, if I have to go back to where it happened. You'll be fine, he promised. You'll have friends this time. Percy Jackson. He's got a role to play in this. You can sense that, can't you? He's a good person to have at your side. Hazel remembered what Pluto told her long ago. A descendant of Neptune will wash away your curse and give you peace. Was Percy the one? Maybe, but Hazel sensed it wouldn't be so easy. She wasn't sure even Percy could survive what was waiting in the north. Where did he come from? She asked. Why did the ghosts call him the Greek? Before Nico could respond, horns blew across the river. The legionnaires were gathering for evening muster. We better get down there, Nico said. I have a feeling tonight's war games are going to be interesting. Chapter 7. Hazel. On the way back, Hazel tripped over a gold bar. She should have known not to run so fast, but she was afraid of being late for muster. The 5th cohort had the nicest centurions in camp. Still, even they would have to punish her if she was tardy. Roman punishments were harsh: scrubbing the streets with a toothbrush, cleaning the bullpens at the Colosseum, getting sewn inside a sack full of angry weasels and dumped into the little Tiber. The options were not great. The gold bar popped out of the ground just in time for her foot to hit it. Nico tried to catch her, but she took a spill and scraped her hands. You okay? Nico knelt next to her and reached for the bar of gold. Don't, Hazel warned. Nico froze. Right, sorry, it's just... Geez, that thing is huge. He pulled a flask of nectar from his aviator jacket and poured a little on Hazel's hands. Immediately the cut started to heal. Can you stand? He helped her up. They both stared at the gold. It was the size of a bread loaf, stamped with a serial number and the words US Treasury. Nico shook his head. How in Tartarus? I don't know, Hazel said miserably. It could have been buried there by robbers or dropped off a wagon 100 years ago. Maybe it migrated from the nearest bank vault. Whatever's in the ground, anything close to me, it just pops up. And the more valuable it is, the more dangerous it is, Nico frowned. Should we cover it up? If the fawns find it? Hazel imagined a mushroom cloud billowing up from the road, char-broiled fawns tossed in every direction. It was too horrible to consider. It should sink back underground, after I leave, eventually, but just to be sure. She'd been practicing this trick, but never with something so heavy and dense. She pointed at the gold bar and tried to concentrate. The gold levitated. She channeled her anger, which wasn't hard. She hated that gold. She hated her curse. She hated thinking about her past and all the ways she'd failed. Her fingers tingled. The gold bar glowed with heat. Nico gulped. Hazel, are you sure? She made a fist. The gold bent like putty. Hazel forced it to twist into a giant lumpy ring, and then she flicked her hand towards the ground. Her $1 million donut slammed into the earth. It sank so deep nothing was left but a scar of fresh dirt. Nico's eyes widened. That was terrifying. Hazel didn't think it was so impressive compared to the powers of a guy who could reanimate skeletons and bring people back from the dead, but it felt good to surprise him for a change. Inside the camp, horns blew again. The cohorts would be starting roll call, and Hazel had no desire to be sewn into a sack of weasels. Hurry, she told Nico, and they ran for the gates. The first time Hazel had seen the Legion assemble, she'd been so intimidated she'd almost slunk back to the barracks to hide. Even after being at camp for 9 months, she still found it an impressive sight. The first 4 cohorts, each 40 kids strong, stood in rows in front of their barracks on either side of the Via Praetoria. The 5th cohort assembled at the very end, in front of the Principia. Since their barracks were tucked in the back corner of a camp next to the stables and the latrines, Hazel had to run right down the middle of the Legion to reach her place. The campers were dressed for war. Their polished chainmail and greaves gleamed over purple t-shirts and jeans. Sword and skull designs decorated their helmets. Even their leather combat boots looked ferocious with their iron cleats, great for marching through mud or stomping on faces. In front of the legionnaires, like a line of giant dominoes, stood their red and gold shields, each the size of a refrigerator door. Every legionnaire carried a harpoon-like spear called a pilum, a gladius, a dagger, and about 100 pounds of other equipment. If you were out of shape when you came to the Legion, you didn't stay for that long. Just walking around in your armour was full-body workout. Hazel and Nico jogged down the street as everyone was coming to attention, so their entrance was really obvious. Their footsteps echoed on the stones. Hazel tried to avoid eye contact, but she caught Octavian at the head of the first cohort smirking at her, looking smug in his plumed centurion's helmet, with a dozen medals pinned on his chest. Hazel was still seething from his blackmail threats earlier. Stupid augur and his gift of prophecy. Of all the people at camp to discover her secrets, why did it have to be him? She was sure he would have told on her weeks ago, except that he knew her secrets were worth more to him as leverage. She wished she'd kept that bar of gold so she could hit him in the face with it. She ran past Raina, who was cantering back and forth on her Pegasus Scipio, nicknamed Skippy because he was the colour of peanut butter. The metal dogs, Arum and Argentum, trotted at her side. Her purple officer's cape billowed behind her. "Hazel Levesque," she called. "So glad you could join us." Hazel knew better than to respond. She was missing most of her equipment, but she hurried to her place in line next to Frank and stood at attention. Their lead centurion, a big 17-year-old guy named Dakota, was just calling her name, the last one on the roll. "Present," she squeaked. Thank the gods. Technically, she wasn't late. Nico joined Percy Jackson, who was standing off to one side with a couple of guards. Percy's hair was wet from the baths. He put on fresh clothes, but he still looked uncomfortable. Hazel couldn't blame him. He was about to be introduced to 200 heavily armed kids. The Lairs were the last ones to fall in. Their purple forms flickered as they jockeyed for places. They had an annoying habit of standing halfway inside living people, so that the ranks looked like a blurry photograph. But finally the centurions got them sorted out. Octavian shouted, "Colours!" The standard bearers stepped forward. They wore lion-skin capes and held poles decorated with each cohort's emblems. The last to present his standard was Jacob, the Legion's eagle-bearer. He held a long pole with absolutely nothing on top. The job was supposed to be a big honour, but Jacob obviously hated it. Even though Raina insisted on following tradition, every time the eagle-less pole was raised, Hazel could feel embarrassment rippling through the Legion. Raina brought her Pegasus to a halt. "Romans," she announced, "you've probably heard about the incursion today. 2 Gorgons were swept into the river by the newcomer, Percy Jackson. Juno herself guided him here and proclaimed him a son of Neptune." The kids in the back rows craned their necks to see Percy. He raised his hand and said, "Hi." "He seeks to join the Legion," Raina continued. "What do the auguries say?" "I have read the entrails," Octavian announced, as if he'd killed a lion with his bare hands rather than ripping up a stuffed panda pillow. "The auguries are favourable. He is qualified to serve." The campers gave a shout. "Ave! Hail!" Frank was a little late with his Ave, so it came out as a high-pitched echo, and the other legionnaires snickered. Raina motioned the senior officers forward, one from each cohort. Octavian, as the most senior centurion, turned to Percy. "Recruit," he asked, "do you have credentials? Letters of reference?" Hazel remembered this from her own arrival. A lot of kids brought letters from older demigods in the outside world, adults who were veterans of the camp. Some recruits had rich and famous sponsors, some were 3rd or 4th generation campers. A good letter could get you a position in the better cohorts, sometimes even special jobs like Legion Messenger, which made you exempt from the grunt work like digging ditches or conjugating Latin verbs. Percy shifted. "Letters? No." Octavian wrinkled his nose. "Unfair," Hazel wanted to shout. Percy had carried a goddess into camp. What better recommendation could you want? But Octavian's family had been sending kids to camp for over a century. He loved reminding recruits that they were less important than he was. "No letters," Octavian said regretfully. "Will any legionnaires stand for him?" "I will." Frank stepped forward. "He saved my life." Immediately there were shouts of protest from the other cohorts. Raina raised her hand for quiet and glared at Frank. "Frank Zhang," she said, "for the second time today I remind you that you are on probatio. Your godly parent has not even claimed you yet. You're not eligible to stand for another camper until you've earned your first stripe." Frank looked like he might die of embarrassment. Hazel couldn't leave him hanging. She stepped out of line and said, "What Frank means is that Percy saved both our lives. I am a full member of the Legion. I will stand for Percy Jackson." Frank glanced at her gratefully, but the other campers started to mutter. Hazel was barely eligible. She'd only got her stripe a few weeks ago, and the act of valour that earned it for her had been mostly on accident. Besides, she was a daughter of Pluto, and a member of the disgraced 5th cohort. She wasn't doing Percy much of a favour by giving him her support. Rayna wrinkled her nose, but she turned to Octavian. The augur smiled and shrugged, like the idea amused him. Why not? Hazel thought. Putting Percy in the 5th would make him less of a threat, and Octavian liked to keep all his enemies in one place. Very well, Rayna announced. Hazel Levesque, you may stand for the recruit. Does your cohort accept him? The other cohort started coughing, trying not to laugh. Hazel knew what they were thinking. Another loser for the 5th. Frank pounded his shield against the ground. The other members of the 5th followed his lead, though they didn't seem very excited. Their centurions, Dakota and Gwen, exchanged pained looks like, here we go again. My cohort has spoken, Dakota said. We accept the recruit. Rayna looked at Percy with pity. Congratulations, Percy Jackson. You stand on probatio. You will be given a tablet with your name and cohort. In 1 year's time, or as soon as you complete an act of valour, you will become a full member of the 12th Legion Fulminata. Serve Rome, obey the rules of the Legion and defend the camp with honour. Senatus Populesque Romanus. The rest of the Legion echoed the cheer. Rayna wheeled her Pegasus away from Percy, like she was glad to be done with him. Skippy spread his beautiful wings. Hazel couldn't help feeling a pang of envy. She'd give anything for a horse like that, but it would never happen. Horses were for officers only, or barbarian cavalry, not for Roman legionnaires. Centurions, Rayna said, you and your troops have 1 hour for dinner. Then we will meet on the field of Mars. The 1st and 2nd cohorts will defend. The 3rd, 4th and 5th will attack. Good fortune. A bigger cheer went up, for the war games and for dinner. The cohorts broke ranks and ran for the mess hall. Hazel waved at Percy, who made his way through the crowd with Nico at his side. To Hazel's surprise, Nico was beaming at her. Good job, sis, he said. That took guts, standing for him. He had never called her sis before. She wondered if that was what he called Bianca. One of the guards had given Percy his probatio nameplate. Percy stung it on his leather neckplace with the strange beads. Thanks, Hazel, he said. What exactly does it mean? You standing for me? I guarantee your good behaviour, Hazel explained. I teach you the rules, answer your questions, make sure you don't disgrace the Legion. And if I do something wrong, then I get killed along with you, Hazel said. Hungry? Let's eat. Chapter 8. Hazel. At least the camp food was good. Invisible wind spirits, Ori, waited on the campers and seemed to know exactly what everyone wanted. They blew plates and cups around so quickly the mess hall looked like a delicious hurricane. If you got up too fast, you were likely to get beaned by beans or potted by a pot roast. Hazel got shrimp gumbo, her favourite comfort food. It made her think about being a little girl in New Orleans before her curse set in and her mum got so bitter. Percy got a cheeseburger and a strange-looking soda that was bright blue. Hazel didn't understand that, but Percy tried it and grinned. This makes me happy, he said. I don't know why, but it does. Just for a moment, one of the Ori became visible, an elfin girl in a white silk dress. She giggled as she topped off Percy's glass and then disappeared in a gust. The mess hall seemed especially noisy tonight. Laughter echoed off the walls. War banners rustled from cedar ceiling beams as Ori blew back and forth, keeping everyone's plates full. The campers dined Roman style, sitting on couches around low tables. Kids were constantly getting up and trading places, spreading rumours about who liked whom and all the other gossip. As usual, the 5th cohort took the place of least honour. Their tables were at the back of the dining hall next to the kitchen. Hazel's table was always the least crowded. Tonight, it was she and Frank, as usual, with Percy and Nico, and their centurion Dakota, who sat there, Hazel figured, because he felt obligated to welcome the new recruit. Dakota reclined glumly on his couch, mixing sugar into his drink and chugging it. He was a beefy guy with curly black hair and eyes that didn't quite line up straight, so Hazel felt like the world was leaning whenever she looked at him. It wasn't a good sign that he was drinking so much so early in the night. So, he burped, waving his goblet. Welcome to the Percy party, he frowned. Party, Percy, whatever. Thanks, Percy said, but his attention was focused on Nico. I was wondering if we could talk, about where I might have seen you before. Sure, Nico said, a little too quickly. The thing is, I spend most of my time in the underworld, so unless I met you there somehow... Dakota belched. Ambassador from Pluto, they call him. Rayna's never sure what to do with this guy when he visits. You should have seen her face when he showed up with Hazel, asking Raina to take her in. No offence. None taken. Nico seemed relieved to change the topic. Dakota was really helpful, standing for Hazel. Dakota blushed. Yeah, well, she seemed like a good kid. Turned out I was right. Last month she saved me from a... you know. Oh, man. Frank looked up from his fish and chips. Percy, you should have seen her. That's how Hazel got her stripe. The unicorns decided to stampede. It was nothing, Hazel said. Nothing, Frank protested. Dakota would have been trampled. You stood right in front of them, shooed them away, saved his hide. I've never seen anything like it. Hazel bit her lip. She didn't like to talk about it, and she felt uncomfortable, the way Frank made her sound like a hero. In truth, she'd been mostly afraid that the unicorns would hurt themselves in their panic. Their horns were precious metal, silver and gold, so she'd managed to turn them aside simply by concentrating, steering the animals by their horns and guiding them back to the stables. It had got her a full place in the Legion, but it had also started rumours about her strange powers, rumours that reminded her of the bad old days. Percy studied her. Those sea-green eyes made her unsettled. Did you and Nico grow up together? He asked. No, Nico answered for her. I found out that Hazel was my sister only recently. She's from New Orleans. That was true, of course, but not the whole truth. Nico let people think he'd stumbled upon her in modern New Orleans and brought her to camp. It was easier than telling the real story. Hazel had tried to pass herself off as a modern kid. It wasn't easy. Thankfully, demigods didn't use a lot of technology at camp. Their powers tended to make electronic gadgets go haywire, but the first time she went on furlough to Berkeley, she had nearly had a stroke. Televisions, computers, iPods, the internet. It made her glad to get back to the world of ghosts and unicorns and gods. That seemed much less of a fantasy than the 21st century. Nico was still talking about the children of Pluto. There aren't many of us, he said, so we have to stick together. When I found Hazel... You have other sisters? Percy asked, almost as if he knew the answer. Hazel wondered again when he and Nico had met and what her brother was hiding. One, Nico admitted, but she died. I saw her spirit a few times in the underworld, except that the last time I went down there. To bring her back, Hazel thought, though Nico didn't say that. She was gone. Nico's voice turned hoarse. She used to be in Elysium, like the underworld paradise, but she chose to be reborn into a new life. Now, I'll never see her again. I was just lucky to find Hazel. In New Orleans, I mean. Dakota grunted. Unless you believe the rumours. Not saying that I do. Rumours? Percy asked. From across the room, Don the Fawn yelled, Hazel! Hazel had never been so glad to see the Fawn. He wasn't allowed in camp, but of course he always managed to get in. He was working his way towards their table, grinning at everybody, sneaking food off plates and pointing at campers. Hey, call me! A flying pizza smacked him in the head, and he disappeared behind a couch, and then he popped up, still grinning, and made his way over. My favourite girl! He smelled like a wet goat wrapped in goat-old cheese. He leaned over their couches and checked out their food. Say, new kid, you going to eat that? Percy frowned. Aren't fawns vegetarian? Not the cheeseburger, man, the plate! He sniffed Percy's hair. Hey, what's that smell? Don, Hazel said, don't be rude. No, man, I just... Their house-got Vitellius shimmered into existence, standing half embedded in Frank's couch. Fawns in the dining hall, what are we going to do? What is this coming to? Centurion Dakota, do your duty. I am. Dakota grumbled into his goblet. I'm having dinner. Don was still sniffing around Percy. Man, you've got an empathy link with a fawn. Percy leaned away from him. A what? An empathy link. It's real faint, like somebody suppressed it, but... I know what. Nico stood suddenly. Hazel, how about we give you and Frank time to get Percy oriented. Dakota and I can visit the Praetor's table. Don and Vitellius, you come too. We can discuss strategies for the war games. Strategies for losing, Dakota muttered. Deaf boy is right, Vitellius said. This legion fights worse than we did in Judea, and that was the first time we lost our eagle. Why, if I were in charge... Could I just eat the silverware first? Don asked. Let's go. Nico stood and grabbed Don and Vitellius by the ears. Nobody but Nico could actually touch the lairs. Vitellius spluttered with outrage as he was dragged off to the Praetor's table. Ow! Don protested. Man, watch the throw. Come on, Dakota. Nico called over his shoulder. The Centurion got up reluctantly. He wiped his mouth, uselessly, since it was permanently stained red. Back soon. He shook all over like a dog trying to get dry, and then he staggered away, his goblet sloshing. What was that about? Percy asked. And what's wrong with Dakota? Frank sighed. He's okay. He's a son of Bacchus, the wine god. He's got a drinking problem. Percy's eyes widened. You let him drink wine? Gods no, Hazel said. That would be a disaster. He's addicted to red Kool-Aid, drinks it with 3 times the normal sugar, and he's already ADHD. You know, attention deficit hyperactive. One of these days, his head is going to explode. Percy looked over at the praetor's table. Most of the senior officers were in deep conversation with Rayner. Nico and his 2 captives, Don and Vitellius, stood on the periphery. Dakota was running back and forth along a line of stacked shields, banging his goblet on them like they were a xylophone. ADHD, Percy said. You don't say. Hazel tried not to laugh. Well, most demigods are, or dyslexic. Just being a demigod means that our brains are wired differently. Like you said you had a trouble reading? Are you guys that way too? Percy asked. I don't know, Hazel admitted. Maybe. Back in my day, they just called kids like us lazy. Percy frowned. Back in your day? Hazel cursed herself. Luckily for her, Frank spoke up. I wish I was ADHD or dyslexic. All I got is lactose intolerance. Percy grinned. Seriously? Frank might have been the silliest demigod ever, but Hazel thought he was cute when he pouted. His shoulders slumped. And I love ice cream too. Percy laughed. Hazel couldn't help joining in. It was good to sit at dinner and actually feel like she was among friends. Okay, so tell me, Percy said, why is it bad to be in the 5th cohort? You guys are great. The compliment made Hazel's toes tingle. It's complicated. Aside from being Pluto's kid, I want to ride horses. That's why you use a cavalry sword? She nodded. It's stupid, I guess. Wishful thinking. There's only one Pegasus at camp, Rayner's. The unicorns are just kept for medicine because the shavings off their horns cure poisoning and stuff. Anyway, Roman fighting is always done on foot. Cavalry. They kind of look down on that, so they look down on me. Their loss, Percy said. What about you, Frank? Archery, he muttered. They don't like that either unless you're a child of Apollo, and then you've got an excuse. I hope my dad is Apollo, but I don't know. I can't do poetry very well, and I'm not sure I want to be related to Octavian. Can't blame you, Percy said. But you're excellent with the bow. The way you pegged those gorgons. Forget what other people think. Frank's face turned as red as Dakota's Kool-Aid. Wish I could. They all think I should be a sword fighter because I'm big and bulky. He looked down at his body, like he couldn't quite believe it was his. They say I'm too stocky for an archer. Maybe if my dad would ever claim me. They ate in silence for a few minutes. A dad who wouldn't claim you. Hazel knew that feeling. She sensed Percy could relate too. You asked about the 5th, she said at last. Why, it's the worst cohort. That actually started way before us. She pointed to the back wall, where the Legion's standards were on display. See the empty pole in the middle? The eagle, Percy said. Hazel was stunned. How did you know? Percy shrugged. Vitellius was talking about how the Legion lost its eagle a long time ago. The first time, he said. He acted like it was a huge disgrace. I'm guessing that's what's missing. And from the way you and Rayner were talking earlier, I'm guessing your eagle got lost a second time, more recently, and it had something to do with the 5th cohort. Hazel made a mental note not to underestimate Percy again. When he'd first arrived, she thought he was a little goofy from the questions he'd asked, about the feast for tuna and all, but clearly he was smarter than he let on. You're right, she said. That's exactly what happened. So what is this eagle anyway? Why is it a big deal? Frank looked around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. It's the symbol of the whole camp. A big eagle made of gold. It's supposed to protect us in battle and make our enemies afraid. Each legion's eagle gave it all sorts of power, and ours came from Jupiter himself. Supposedly Julius Caesar nicknamed our legion Fulminata, armed with lightning, because of what the eagle could do. I don't like lightning, Percy said. Yeah, well, Hazel said, it didn't make us invincible. The 12th lost its eagle the first time way back in ancient days, during the Jewish rebellion. I think I saw a movie like that, Percy said. Hazel shrugged. Could be. There have been lots of books and movies about legions losing their eagles. Unfortunately, it happened quite a few times. The eagle was so important. Well, archaeologists have never recovered a single eagle from ancient Rome. Each legion guarded theirs to the last man because it was charged with power from the gods. They'd rather hide it or melt it down than surrender it to an enemy. The 12th was lucky the first time. We got our eagle back, but the second time. You guys were there? Percy asked. They both shook their heads. I'm almost as new as you. Frank tapped his probatio plate. Just got here last month, but everyone's heard the story. It's bad luck to even talk about this. There was this huge expedition to Alaska back in the 80s. That prophecy you noticed in the temple, Hazel continued. The one about the 7 demigods and the doors of death. Our senior praetor at the time was Michael Varus, from the 5th cohort. Back from the 5th. Back then the 5th was the best in camp. He thought it would bring glory to the Legion if he could figure out the prophecy, make it come true, save the world from storm and fire and all that. He talked to the augur, and the augur said the answer was in Alaska. But he warned Michael it wasn't time yet. The prophecy wasn't for him. But he went anyway. Percy guessed. What happened? Frank lowered his voice. Long, gruesome story. Almost the entire 5th cohort was wiped out. Most of Legion's Imperial gold weapons were lost. Along with the Eagle, the survivors went crazy or refused to talk about what had attacked them. I know, Hazel thought solemnly, but she kept silent. Since the Eagle was lost, Frank continued, the camp has been getting weaker. Quests are more dangerous. Monsters attack the borders more often. Morale is lower. The last month or so, things have been getting much worse. Much faster. And the 5th cohort took the blame? Percy guessed. So now everyone thinks we're cursed. Hazel realised her gumbo was cold. She sipped a spoonful, but the comfort food didn't taste very comforting. We've been the outcasts of the Legion since the Alaska disaster. Our reputation got better when Jason became praetor. The kid who's missing? Percy asked. Yeah, Frank said. I never met him. Before my time, but I hear he was a good leader. He practically grew up in the 5th cohort. He didn't care what people thought about us. He started to rebuild our reputation. And then he disappeared. Which put us back at square one, Hazel said bitterly. Made us look cursed all over again. I'm sorry, Percy. Now you know what you've got yourself into. Percy sipped his blue soda and gazed thoughtfully across the dining hall. I don't even know where I come from, but I've got a feeling this isn't the first time I've been an underdog. He focused on Hazel and managed a smile. Besides, joining the Legion is better than being chased through the wilderness by monsters. I've got myself some new friends. Maybe together we can turn things around for the 5th cohort. Huh? A horn blew at the end of the hall. The officers at the praetor's table got to their feet, even Dakota, his mouth vampire red from Kool-Aid. The games begin, Rayner announced. The campers cheered and rushed to collect their equipment from the stacks along the walls. So, we're the attacking team, Percy asked over the noise. Is that good? Hazel shrugged. Good news, we get the elephant. Bad news? Let me guess, said Percy. The 5th cohort always loses. Frank slapped Percy on the shoulder. I love this guy. Come on, new friend. Let's go chalk up my 13th defeat in a row.